Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining me. My name is Alex Hagan, and I am a senior at Drury University in Springfield, Missouri. I'm a dual major in history and secondary education, and this is the presentation of my senior project. My project is entitled Florentine Renaissance, the Civic Institutions, Economic Evolutions, and Social Conditions that were the precursors of Renaissance in Florence, Italy in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. Wow, a little bit of a pretentious title. Then again, maybe a very good one, I don't know. But as you know, most historians prefer an informative title. Okay, so before we get into my research, I'd like to touch on the Renaissance time period just briefly, just to give everyone an orientation. I think most scholars agree that the Renaissance began in the late 12th, early 13th centuries on the northern Italian peninsula and moved northward from there over the next 300 years. The region of Tuscany, where Florence is located, is kind of like ground zero for those benchmarks which historians ascribe to Renaissance. Renaissance didn't just happen like walking through a door, as I've been recently reminded by my research and by our professor. Medieval years and Renaissance years blend together. They slowly emerge from the medieval times and enter into the Renaissance years over the course of perhaps 100 years. Would that be fair to say? And so what are those benchmarks that we're talking about that are an indication of Renaissance? Well, that would be the resurgence of scientific investigation, for one, the resurgence of original works of literature, treatises of all sorts, and also the resurgence of realism in art, but many, many other innovations, and these are the things that let us know that the medieval years were over in a certain area and Renaissance had begun. Okay, so moving on to my research project, what all of us had to do at the beginning of our research project was ask ourselves, well, what questions do I want to answer with my research? A couple of semesters ago, I had taken a class on the Renaissance and medieval Europe and became very interested in what forces, what historical forces, social forces, other kinds of things that were occurring in the northern Italian peninsula that brought about the Renaissance. And so this was a question I wanted to ask myself, and that I wanted to research and provide all of us with the answers to. And I also wanted to identify which factors, if any, were more important to the development of Renaissance rather than just a huge summary of all of the facts that I could accumulate about that time period. Okay, so here is a couple of pictures of Florence, Italy. And so you may be asking yourselves now, why Florence specifically? Why did I choose Florence specifically to research? Well, for one thing, we need to narrow the scope of our investigation. And if I study too big of a time frame or too big of an area, then I'm compiling too much data, and our project just simply wouldn't allow for that. But also, modern historians, 20th century historians, some of which I will introduce later in this video, recognize all of those seeds of Renaissance, all of those benchmarks of Renaissance that we just discussed, emerged on the Tuscan plain, and some of them assert specifically in Florence. And so I became curious about this town, and there's a number of notable people that emerged from Florence during the pre-Renaissance years and the Renaissance years. Dante Alighieri, Boccaccio, Brunelleschi, you may recognize as a famous architect, among other things. I think he did some painting too. How about Leonardo da Vinci? Anybody recognize that name? He was from Florence. Michelangelo, also from Florence. Machiavelli, who was very influential in his writings of later years, also from Florence. And so we see this host of brilliant innovators emerging from this town on the Tuscan plain called Florence. Florence is a beautiful city. It's an ancient city. It's situated on the Arno River in the Tuscan plain, and these are some very nice digital photographs of Florence. Okay, so in these images, I just wanted to orient you with where the Tuscan plain was. As you can see in the image on your right, the Tuscan plain is somewhat in the midsection to the north of the Italian peninsula, along the coast and into the interior. And this picture on the left that you see is actually not a stylized painting. That is a digital photograph of the Tuscan plain, and so you can see Tuscany is very beautiful and fertile. Okay, so talking points. It was not my intention with this presentation to reiterate any part of my research. I'm assuming that some of you or all of you are going to be reading my paper, and so you're going to get plenty of my research. But my intention here was to talk about why I specifically wanted to research Florence, which I've already covered, but also to discuss my primary sources, my secondary sources. I wanted to briefly mention the church and why you will not find a whole lot of material here about the church during the time frame of my investigation. And then I wanted to offer some kind of a conclusion that kind of just restates those things which I learned from this investigation. Okay, so primary sources. The first thing I have to do is make a case for Giovanni Villani, which most of you will not have heard of unless you've done Renaissance research before. Giovanni Villani is born in Florence in the mid-13th century. He becomes a banker, but later he becomes a historian, specifically about Florence. And there's a little bit of controversy about using him as a primary source. And the reason is because his early accounts of Florentine history are, for lack of a better term, legends or fairy tales, oral traditions, passed along to him by earlier Florentine historians, and these have been proven to be unreliable. However, Giovanni Villani begins to record Florentine events contemporary to his own time frame, and many historians make a strong case that these historical records are in fact reliable and have been backed up by the archaeological record. And so I have moved Villani from a secondary source to a primary source, and but I only use his later historical recordings. The second thing I ran into with primary sources, or with regard to primary sources, is that most of the records I'm really interested in reading are in vernacular Italian or Latin. Unfortunately for me, I don't understand either one of those languages. I searched in vain for translations for many of those early civic documents and codices. So I think a historian who is doing a professional study of this subject would really need to know Italian and or Latin, and would really need to travel to Italy, probably and research this for about a year minimum, I would think, to really come up with some good research. However, I was able to find several good primary sources at Fordham University's website in a project that they call the Medieval Sourcebook. Actually has hundreds of different primary sources that are all rooted in medieval France and Italy. However, some of those were useful to me and some of them were not. And so I have about 5 or 6 primary sources from Fordham University. Next would be secondary sources. So I rely on a number of 20th century historians for my secondary sources. all of which were very well referenced, and among whom are Edgecombe Staley, written about 1906, Ferdinand Cheville, which was written in the mid to late 30s, and Will Durant did some really nice work in the 50s. You might wonder why I didn't find any more modern historians, some 21st century historians, and to be quite frank, I couldn't find any preeminent modern historians doing work on Florence specifically. And so I rely on these historians, but I think all of them were very well researched and very well regarded and reliable, and they have well-sourced documents. And then an intermediate Florentine historian from the 1500s in the midst of the Renaissance, Niccolo Machiavelli, wrote the Florentine history, and it's very well regarded, and it's used as a primary source and a secondary source by many historians. Next, I would like to deal very briefly with the church, because you will see in my research that the church is only dealt with very briefly. And that is really a short change for the church. So I'd like to just say right up front that the church plays a pivotal role in medieval society. After the collapse of Roman authority, most of Europe looked to the church for leadership, and they provided stability and structure during a very chaotic time. However, during the course of my research, I determined that the church really doesn't play a primary role in predicating Renaissance in Florence in the 13th century. And so for this reason, I decided to omit them from my research to a great extent. It was a practical consideration. I needed to limit the scope of my investigation, and the church just didn't seem like a primary factor. So let's talk about evidence and conclusions next. This is kind of an academic debate for the ages. Did I allow my research to freely form conclusions in me? Or did I predetermine a conclusion and look for evidence which supported that conclusion? I think this is a trap that many historians fall into. For my own part, I tried to remain neutral. I did have a question I wanted to ask with regard to this research paper, but I tried to let the evidence make its own conclusions. And in fact, I did identify some primary social and economic and cultural forces which I believe predicated Renaissance. But you'll have to read my research paper and determine whether or not those stand up for themselves. Lastly, I would like to address the three conclusions that I arrived at from my research. Conclusion number one, evidence clearly demonstrates that there are unique socio-economic forces at work in the Tuscany region in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, and furthermore, I concluded those forces were precursors to Renaissance thinking. I don't think the Renaissance would have happened the way it did, or happened at all, if these forces had not been present in Florence. Evidence also shows strongly that Florence became the administrative, cultural, and spiritual center of the Tuscan plain. And I think that is significant in demonstrating that the epicenter of Renaissance may have been at Florence. And lastly, I think the evidence strongly supports my proposition that ancient Tuscan civic institutions, the rise of mercantilism, and the evolution of Florentine society in terms of education and other aspects of Florentine society, all of these were precursors to the beginning of Renaissance in Florence in the 13th century. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoy my research.